Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Thank you for tuning into the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Shubh Nanda. Welcome back. How's it going? Yeah, I suppose that was a rhetorical question. We're going to talk about some comedy movies today, and that was my attempt at being funny, which makes it very, very clear that I'm probably not qualified to be talking about them. So we're going to start today by talking about one of my favorite indie comedies, Jeff Who Lives at Home, starring Jason Segel. It's this Duplass Brothers film that is the ideal sort of man-child film, which sort of is going to set the tone of two more of the segments that we're going to discuss today. After that, we'll move on to a film that I recently streamed on Hulu, The Female Brain, written and directed by Whitney Cummings. She wrote this with Neil Brennan, who helped create the Chappelle Show. And, you know, me as a person who seems to be susceptible to heartbreak, I felt like I really needed to watch this movie to see what I was doing wrong. At the end of the film, I realized why it's not going to help me at all, because understanding anatomy is not going to get you a girlfriend. Anyway, followed by that, we're going to discuss my favorite Wes Anderson film of all time, which I don't know qualifies as a comedy or not. It's pretty funny, and Bill Murray's in it. But it's called Rushmore. For our last segment, I'm going to be doing something that I feel like I enjoyed doing last episode, which is a Filmmaker Profile. I disguised my sort of talking about Chris Nolan as like a top 5 type of thing. And I'm going to do the same thing this week, but I want to make this another one of my regularly occurring segments. We're going to call it Filmmaker Profiles because I haven't thought of a funnier name yet. Well, it's not like Shubh's hot take is that funny either. But today's filmmaker is Judd Apatow, who I know you have heard me speak about a lot, and you're probably bored of hearing me speak about Judd Apatow, but I promise there are new ideas, new movies that I haven't discussed, and a very surprising number one. So stay tuned for that. But without further ado, let's get into it. Our movie of the week this week, our first movie of the episode, is Jeff Who Lives at Home. So this movie is about Jeff, played by Jason Segel, who relates to the audience as the subject of a classic Duplass Brothers camera zoom, an unhealthy obsession with M. Night Shyamalan's film Signs. Now, having never seen Signs, but having not entirely what someone could consider an appreciation for M. Night Shyamalan's films, I don't know what he sees in it, but it's the start of the movie, and this is a character that I have to root for. Anyway, so it's here in the opening frame where the audience realizes that something is very, very wrong with Jeff. The Duplass Brothers 2012 film is this eccentric and quintessentially Duplass comedy about a man-child who lives in his mother's basement in this constant haze of marijuana and lost potential. His life is probably best defined by the opening title, in that he believes everyone and everything is interconnected. and to fulfill one quote-unquote destiny, we must quote-unquote follow the signs. It sounds exactly like what you'd believe if your life consisted solely of weed, TV infomercials, and the M. Night Shyamalan movie Signs. Jeff Who Lives at Home, it follows these three interconnected storylines within the family. The first is of Jeff, who believes that he has finally found the reason for his existence when the man on the TV selling vitamins tells him to pick up the phone, and when he does, he gets nothing but a name, Kevin. Henceforth begins this life-defining journey across his Louisiana town to fulfill this self-prophesied destiny. The second follows his brother Pat, played by Ed Helms in such a great performance, and his midlife crisis, which prompts him to buy a Porsche that he can't afford and assume that his wife, played by Judy Greer in another fantastic performance, is cheating on him. Typical. Finally, the last storyline is that of Pat and Jeff's mom, Sharon, played by Susan Sarandon, the best performance and the best storyline, who finds herself as the object of affection of a secret admirer in the workplace. Now, comedy in the 21st century, as I'm going to talk about in our last segment, has been Apatowified. There's a lot of stories about grown men behaving like children, since Adam Sandler and Billy Madison and Happy Gilmore. This recurring principle sort of manifests itself regularly and appears in this film as well. While I'm not dismissing Adam Sandler movies as not heady in the typical sense, because if you do want to, you can find a very deep philosophical meaning in a lot of his films. And I'm definitely going to do an episode about that. But Jeff Who Lives at Home, it's a different type of man-child comedy. In Jeff's man-child archetype, we find this ideal blend of innocence and impulsiveness that allows his character to be simultaneously pitiable, through his laziness and appealing in his naivety and curiosity, and we connect to that. But it seems almost necessary for us to pity Jeff in the beginning. He's got nothing going for him, but as he continues this journey with this unending faith in his belief, you begin to admire him and his blind loyalty to signs, both the movie and the metaphysical condition. Jeff's aura of foolish ambivalence is perpetuated by Jason Segel's huge frame and baby face. He is Hollywood's big friendly giant. One of my favorite, most creative people. His performance in this film, it's captivating, it's refreshing, and it's a change to that tradition of modern cinematic comedy. I can imagine that Pat's character description was probably something along the lines of, quote, a broken man who hides his disappointment in his own mediocrity with sarcasm and impulsiveness and an ignorance for all of those around him. Yeah, that sounds about right. His obliviousness of the fact that his marriage is failing seems only to be matched by his delusional conceitedness. He genuinely believes he's a winner, which movies of this genre usually show that he's an insensitive jerk who sports this trademark goatee and spends the money that he promised his wife he'd buy a house with on a Porsche with no down payment because it's practically free. That's exactly what happened in this film. It's no wonder that I felt nothing but a giddy smirk when he crashed his Porsche into a tree. Helms is an actor who rarely plays this kind of jerk role, but easily fits into the archetypal mold with intuition and perfect facial hair. It seemed to me that the only way to sort of salvage any empathy for this character would be if he saved someone's life. And spoiler alert, he does. The zaniness that these immature boys bring is matched, if not exceeded, by their mother, Susan Sarandon's character Sharon. She has this quest for something that isn't taking care of her good-for-nothing kids, which, completely understandable. If those were my kids, I'd run away. It's this middle-class anxiety that she brings to her character and is so vivid in the surroundings of her workplace. There's a drab, anonymous IM message that sparks her mundane job. All of these signs that she's trying to turn a mediocre hand into a royal flush. The normality of the film's context brings to light the intentions of the Duplass brothers to present a critique of the American ideal of this pursuit of happiness, the American dream. The mundanity and its final moments of absolute fantasy, they combine to become this sort of mockery of universal belief in a light at the end of the tunnel. While it might seem that these brothers want us to believe in something at first, with, Jason Segel's character, Jeff, finding what he wants to through his signs, and Ed Helms getting his Porsche, Susan Sarandon's character, Sharon, finding what she thinks might be the true love of her life. It quickly ends up into a sort of psych moment. The culminating 15 minutes is this psych moment. You follow this fantastical series of events that tie together all of the infinite loose ends that the Duplass brothers left for the audience. We watch as all three of these characters are stuck in standstill traffic, but decide to leave their cars and run. First, Pat runs to his wife Linda to tell her about how he feels about reconciling their marriage. On his way, he passes Carol's car with Sharon inside. Carol, spoiler alert, is Sharon's lover. They get out and follow him. And finally, Jeff is seen running out of his taxi beyond his family's reunion and onward towards a drowning father and his 2 kids. He jumps into the water from the bridge. Onlookers watch the spectacle as if a real-life superhero has come to light, but he never makes it out of the water himself despite saving them. Pat then hysterically jumps into the water to save his brother. There's his character redeemed. As the film closes, Jeff, who lives at home, reminds us that while crazy things might happen on occasion, just like Jeff does by gluing the shutters on his window like his mom tells him to, we should take time to appreciate the mundane. Jeff, who lives at home, is this feel-good movie that anyone should and can watch. Despite its immature characters and slightly immature story, the Duplass brothers bring to screen a sentiment that is universally relatable. It allows the audience to see that the universe is as simple as a vitamin infomercial, the haze of marijuana, and a man named Kevin. Alright, with that, let's take a break. We're going to talk later about a movie called The Female Brain. Then we're going to talk about Wes Anderson's Rushmore. And finally, my filmmaker profile on Judd Apatow. So stay tuned.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back. We just spoke about Jeff, who lives at home. Up next is The Female Brain. And before you start thinking that I've suddenly transformed this into a neurology podcast, I'm speaking about the Whitney Cummings film, The Female Brain, named after a book of the same name. Now, this film, I came to it because it's written by Whitney Cummings and Neil Brennan, two of my favorite stand-up comedians. You might know Neil Brennan as one of the co-creators of the Chappelle Show, which is probably the best sketch show ever created. And Whitney Cummings, you might know as the creator of TV series such as Whitney and Two Broke Girls. Now this film, the crux of it, is about a woman who knows so much about the brain that she forgets everything she knows about the heart. Unfortunately, the execution is a little iffy. The woman in question is Whitney Cummings' character herself. She's cast as this neurologist named Julia Brizendine, sort of nod towards the original author of the book, Lou Anne Brizendine, who's a neurologist. Whitney Cummings' character, Julia, is obsessed with cracking the code of the human brain. You know, her study is sort of rooted in understanding all the weird responses of studying female brains and essentially how to battle stereotypes such as, you know, the women are crazy stereotype, for example, and make the world a more, you know, objective and intellectual place. This is Whitney Cummings' first feature filmed as a director, and as I said, she wrote this with her friend and longtime comedy writer Neil Brennan. And, you know, both of the comedians, they have this flair for lateral thinking and an interest in relationships, but not only just relationships in the mundane way like most comedians do. They have been quite outspoken in their conversations about the neurology of relationships, as you can see from Whitney Cummings' podcast, Good For You, or even Neil Brennan's appearance on podcasts like You Made It Weird, or even his own podcast. I think it's called How Neil Feel. All of these podcasts are great listens. I highly recommend. Anyway, in the film, the raunchiest material, the material that you would assume would go straight to Whitney Cummings, is reserved for her co-stars. And a lot of the tone that strikes in this film is so much more gentle and very almost, it fits the conventional tone of the genre. It's not what you expect when you are so familiar with Whitney Cummings' tone in her stand-up appearances, in her roasts, or even the TV series that she co-created, like Two Broke Girls. And it just doesn't feel authentic. As I said, Whitney Cummings plays this buttoned-down, sort of closed-off neurologist, and her character is a spin-off of the author Lou Anne Brizendine, who wrote this 2007 non-fiction bestseller called The Female Brain. As a university researcher, Julia, Whitney Cummings' character, has a job that studies the effects of various stimuli on the chemistry of male and female brains. One of the scenes sees her sort of test the reactions of a man to an adorable kitten or babies. The film has one consistently hilarious bit that sort of defines the tone as a science-based rom-com, which is a significant departure from technically from most genre conventions. It's the funniest bit of the film for me. It follows how Whitney Cummings sort of voiceovers these highly technical sort of medical arguments that would definitely be drawn from the book Lou Anne Brizendine wrote. And it's shown with a bunch of sort of archival footage, and it really helps illustrate her points. Because while we are provided with sort of a very quick barrage full of medical terms like cortisol and amygdala, she also relates it to how we might colloquially refer to in conversation today. One of the scenes that we can recall is when speaking about how a woman's amygdala, the fear sensor part of the brain, is more attuned to finding danger. We see two characters dealing with a mirror that is hanging awkwardly and might fall on the bed, and the woman is more concerned about it falling off, whereas the man is sort of apathetic. In the film, Whitney Cummings as an actress is sort of locked into this role that isn't very dynamic, but she's really sharp as an actor and as a personality, so you get this sense of spark that you wouldn't really expect from a character had it been played by someone else, especially played by someone that wasn't a comic. And this is true in so many of her scenes where she's present with Beanie Feldstein, probably one of the premier actors of our generation. She's incredible in this film. Beanie Feldstein injects a life, like a sense of energy into this film like no other. She's got this naturalism in her screen presence that's just extremely appealing. Anyway, Cummings as a director is a little less successful in this film, especially with the movie's subplots. The subplots are these three couples that have been subjects of Whitney Cummings' character's study, and she uses them in sort of a framing of a TED Talk-like situation to display her results. We never really see her interact with any of them on screen, which I feel like could have helped. And they never really interact with each other except for one random scene where James Marsden and Dion Cole's characters are in the park together. This sort of really makes the film feel scattered. I assume it had something to do with the science aspect of it, but even then, if they made it clear, that probably would have worked better. You know, the film, it's initially compelled by this idea that stereotypes are bad, and that seems to be the sort of driving force behind Julia's motivation, as well as a lot of the other characters. But the female brain, it just doesn't exist without stereotypes. There's this formulaic approach, and very obviously formulaic approach to this film. And it sort of feels very predictable and static and quite cynical, to be honest. Had it been a little bit more sardonic, you would have assumed that it was a satire. Anyway, the subplots follow three couples. There's Stephen and Lisa, played by Dion Cole and Sofia Vergara. They're this longtime married couple who lose the spark in their relationship. There's Lexi and Adam, played by Lucy Punch and James Marsden. Theirs is the story of the stereotypically shrewd woman who keeps trying to change her man. And finally, there's Zoe and Greg, played by Cecily Strong and Blake Griffin. Their couple is one that, you know, gets married so fast they don't really figure out who they are in the relationship in terms of their roles and individualities. You know, with the exception of Zoe and Greg, played by Cecily Strong and Blake Griffin, the couples really aren't that engaging, and their stories aren't either. They're very straightforward, they're very stereotypical. Blake Griffin, as I promised, he plays naturally a pro basketball player. You know, what else do you get a 6'9" athlete to play in a film, regardless of how funny he is? And Cecily Strong plays an advertising executive who hates her job, but also doesn't want to be another one of the Real Housewives of Beverly Hills. When Greg is injured, he starts to spend a lot more time in their house, and this starts to put a strain on their marriage, considering they're used to spending the day apart and then reconvening at night. They have great energy, they have great chemistry, and Blake Griffin has this incredible deadpan delivery and timing. If you get a chance, you should watch him on a roast battle. He kills it. He's actually probably got a good career in comedy if he like tries hard enough. But the other two couples, they're really bland, you know. Sofia Vergara, Dion Cole, they play this dull marriage, which I guess is the point, of this husband and wife in their 40s whose romantic spark dies, and then they eventually get an amicable divorce because, 12 years is more than usual. Lucy Punch and James Marsden, there's no progression in that storyline. The Sofia Vergara and Dion Cole storyline sort of goes into this classic cliche in order to not only create laughs but reason for them to stay together, which is to do MDMA, and it just doesn't work. These people don't belong together, so there's nothing to root for there. Just as these couples start to implode, Julia, Whitney Cummings' character herself, she falls in love with this manly, like very rustic, lumbersexual participant of her study, Kevin. We're not going to get into the ethical implications of that because that's clearly wrong. You're not supposed to be dating someone within your study. He's introduced as someone with the mental capacity, in terms of at least like empathy, of a caveman, because his brain doesn't react the same way a normal human would react when seeing images of kittens and babies. Then there's the question of why Julia would even bother. This guy, the only thing he has going for him is that he can make some really fast, quick-witted, banterous responses. Yeah, no, that's about it. That's the only sort of explanation. There's a motivation behind it, in that Julia believes that she can control her sexuality because she has an understanding of neuroscience. But, I just don't... There's nothing there authentically to make me root for them. At the end of the day, the female brain sort of gives itself over to its own issues. And, despite being a movie that understands the brain so much, it fails to really capture ours. And by the time the film sort of goes into our own sort of random ending, it just becomes a very familiar, another movie in a box of generic rom-coms with a slight gimmick type of film. It was funny though. Dialogue was good. That's about it. Anyway, with that, let's take a break. We will be back with Rushmore and then my filmmaker's profile on Judd Apatow. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
And welcome back. We just spoke about The Female Brain, directed by Whitney Cummings, and the Duplass brothers, Jeff Who Lives at Home. I want to talk about one of my favorite, probably my favorite, Wes Anderson movie. Now, my relationship with Wes Anderson is quite interesting because I think he's a fantastic director. He's definitely one of the most obvious auteurs of our time, with his sort of very discernible, idiosyncratic way of filmmaking. But his second feature, Rushmore, it's in its genre of its own. Wes Anderson, I was introduced to his movies in the 11th grade, and for some reason, I always found myself drawn to girls whose favorite director was Wes Anderson. In the 11th grade, I was dating this girl, and she made me watch pretty much all of his movies, which, I thank her for. But at the time, I guess I sort of bought into the idea that Wes Anderson was my favorite director, which, he can be for some people. I'm not discrediting the work that he's done because he is a foremost American auteur, but there are some inconsistencies that I feel we find in his latter work, especially with movies like The Life Aquatic of Steve Zissou. But Rushmore is my favorite. That's why we're going to talk about it. It's not exactly a comedy, it's not exactly a drama. It's this eccentric and quirky story that follows Max Fisher, played by Jason Schwartzman, a very common collaborator of Wes Anderson, and follows his pursuits in the eponymous Rushmore Academy. Now, Max Fisher is an overachiever. He is shown in this skillful montage to be the founder, captain, manager of every club or extracurricular imaginable, ranging from beekeeping to trap and skeet. Now, I remember when I first saw this montage, it was incredible. And I found it extremely relatable because for some reason I thought that I was also someone like that in my high school, that I would, spread myself thin and take charge of so many different things. I didn't. I had 3 responsibilities maximum and I didn't even do them on time. But his extracurricular pursuits, they land him in hot water with regards to his grades, and he's eventually placed on academic probation. He wrote this film with his Bottle Rocket collaborator and longtime friend Owen Wilson, who, again, is another one of Anderson's most common, frequent collaborators. Wes Anderson brings to screen this subtly profound story of friendship under the guise of this sort of infantilized comedy. And true to his style, monochromatic color palette. What is a Wes Anderson story without beautiful color palette that you can discern and then eventually find on the tumblers of many, 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 many film fans across the world? The film opens with this sort of trite scene, I guess. It places Fisher on a pedestal. It sees him solve what his mathematics teacher describes as an impossible problem, to the applause and reverence of his peers. And this fleeting moment of cliche, it's short-lived. And the next cut reveals that his moment was just a dream. This is a dream that Max had during his gathering at the school church. And Anderson makes it clear that Max Fisher is no ordinary high school archetype. And that sort of sense threads through this entire film. The essence of this film is the relationship between Schwartzman's Fisher and Bill Murray's Herman Bloom, and their conflict over elementary school teacher Rosemary Cross, played by Olivia Williams. Fisher and Bloom are shown as these two reminders of Cross's previous life, of her husband. One reminds her of the young man that she fell in love with, and the other the aged man that she never got the chance to grow with. And Anderson uses this conflict to sort of develop his characters, showing Fisher's potential misallocated, as per usual, in his quest for a woman who is nothing more than a maternal figure to him. And Bloom's aspirations to find his soul through the redevelopment of childish tendencies, which are the majority of this film. His childish tendencies take their form in a sort of infantilized combat between him and Max Fisher's obsession with Rosemary Cross, let's say. This conflict, you can see it when Max informs Herman's wife of her husband's affair with Rosemary, to which Herman responds by running over his bike multiple times, and then this childish sort of back and forth comes to an end when Max is arrested after he cuts the brake wires in Herman's car. One of the best parts of this film was Bill Murray's performance. Heading into this film, Bill Murray had a bunch of weaker performances in it, Larger Than Life and The Man Who Knew Too Little. There was a rumor of decline in his performance quality, and sort of, this sort of revived his reputation a little bit. His performance is probably best exemplified in the scene at his character's home. The audience sees this broken man aimlessly chucking golf balls into an empty pool as he watches his wife flirt with her tennis coach. The scene is split into two. There's a foreground on Murray's side profile as he smokes a cigarette, and a background of his wife feeding cake to her tennis coach endearingly. While the camera switches focus from foreground to background, there's a small cut that shows us the family portrait of the Blooms, which quickly cuts back to the original image with the fitting background of nothing in the world can stop me worrying about that girl by the Kinks. In a nutshell, that is what I appreciate about Wes Anderson's directing. But also, Murray's facial expression is not one of melancholy. There's a slight smirk there. It shows a man who's lost just about everything he had to live for, but accepts it as a fact. And still, he's not just a depressive lost soul. To call him that, it would be reductive. Instead, Bill Murray, as per usual, brings his character the classic, unique brand of comedy that we've known for so long. He makes audiences laugh with symbol changes in intonation or slight rolls in his eye, with very subtle and dynamic performances that create and bring to life the archetypal midlife crisis man in the form of Herman Bloom. This film, it's an ode to those who struggle to find their place in life. Every character, regardless of how small the role seems to be, grapples with the issue of finding their place. It starts with Max, who tries to find what life will be like after Rushmore, to Herman, who attempts to reforge the fire in his life, right down to Dirk, Max's best friend, who just wants people to stop thinking that his mom gave his best friend a hand job in the back of their car. Anderson brings this thematic unity to manifestation at the end of the film, which is an ensemble combining on the dance floor, dancing to a kook song. It links both young and old in this transient moment of reunion. Max is seen dancing in the middle with Rosemary, but Herman and Margaret are closely behind. And Anderson closes the movie as if it was Max's play, with a curtain call. That play scene in the film is one of my favorites because it sort of captures what my spirit was like in high school. I always wanted to direct a play. I actually had a play that I was writing but never got the chance. Well, I shouldn't say never got the chance. I never gave myself the chance to direct. Looking back after having watched this movie again this week, it made me very nostalgic for high school. And it reminded me that this is a movie that I completely forgot to mention in my list of high school movies with Matthew the other day. Because this is actually my favorite high school movie of all time. It's just been so long since I watched it. Rushmore, there's this picture of Max, I remember, of him standing next to a burning pile of stuff that I used as my Spotify playlist cover for my work playlist, which was full of like these instrumental classical songs and like lo-fi beats for study and all that kind of stuff. That's how much it meant to me back then. But Rushmore is this quirky film, like I said. It defies the boundaries of genre. You know, it might be too quirky for some, especially for those who don't appreciate naive pseudo-intellectuals like myself. When I say that, I mean I am a naive pseudo-intellectual. Or, you know, a good midlife crisis story, which is definitely something I'm heading towards. But the film brings to screen the story of those who try their best to find where they belong in a quick-witted, deeply layered fashion. Wes Anderson's film Rushmore is more than just another high school movie because it's, for me, the one that hits closest to home. And I can't believe I forgot to mention it in our podcast last week. Anyway, with that, let's take a break. We'll be back with my dissection and appreciation of my idol Judd Apatow and his filmography. I'm not going to dissect Judd Apatow, though it would be cool to pick his brain.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Hello and welcome back. So for our final segment today, I want to talk about Judd Apatow. Judd Apatow, for me, is the person who defines 21st century mainstream entertainment American comedy. I know that's probably like a very niche way of putting it, but when you think of all the biggest blockbusters in Hollywood, you think of Judd Apatow movies. And for me, you know, there comes a time where someone's seen so many interviews and appearances of a specific person, especially when it comes to a comic, that you can tell the difference between a joke that they come up with on the spot or one that they've worked on through multiple settings. And I know this is a little stalkerish, but for me, that's Judd Apatow. I mean, don't blame me. Like people find their extreme fandoms in people like Zendaya, like Harry Styles, or like Brad Pitt. I don't know what the age of my audience is, but mine is a middle-aged comedy producer whose most recurring joke is my level of fame is when someone approaches to ask if I'm Judd Apatow and I say no, they go, and move on. And every time he makes that joke on a talk show, I still laugh. I think one of the reasons I love Judd Apatow's stuff is because he writes what he knows. A lot of writers will go against that advice, but for some reason it seems to work for Judd Apatow. You know, he writes about the feeling of Arrested Development. He uses improvisation to create comedy in the moment. He's not afraid to change his story as it goes. His use of emotion disguised under comic realism is in abundance, and while there might be some recreational substance use, it's his socio-comedy, as Desus and Miro described it during their interview with Judd recently. It's that socio-dirty comedy full of dick jokes that makes it incredible. and it makes it real. All of his movies follow someone that's stuck, and he invites us to root for them as they get unstuck. He said that one of his first stories was this spec script that he did for The Simpsons. It was eventually made into an episode, but the story is basically that Homer is hypnotized into becoming a 5-year-old boy and refuses to return to his life for the fear of having to take responsibility again. At the end of the day, that's Judd Apatow and his movies in a nutshell. They all have that same crux. They're all stories about these immature people that go through something and then learn to take responsibility, be that for themselves, in relationships, in their communities, however it may be. His movies don't try to glamorize anything about life because life is messy. He said, the ones growing up, that he would rarely see movies about the not Hollywood caliber sort of beautiful people. And I suppose he took that beyond anything and eventually made a career and quite a living out of it. Another defining characteristic of Judd Apatow movies are his frequent collaborations. Now, when you think of a Judd Apatow movie, usually you think of Seth Rogen, but surprisingly, Paul Rudd is Judd Apatow's most frequent collaborator. What started as in the old days, I suppose, for him. This is when I was born. But what started as sort of working with the friends and the talent that he cultivated in his early days, be it working with Steve Carell on The 40-Year-Old Virgin after seeing him work on Anchorman, working with Jim Carrey on The Cable Guy after living with him, doing stand-up with Jim Carrey and Adam Sandler because they were roommates growing up together. Jonah Hill getting a job on Get Him to the Greek and Superbad after working with Judd on Knocked Up. Judd always involves people that he finds funny and wants to work with. And he provides these roles to the people that he thinks are funny and up and coming. We see Bo Burnham in Funny People. We see Mindy Kaling in 40-Year-Old Virgin. Pete Davidson got his own film after appearing in Trainwreck and impressing everyone with his hilarity. All of this just adds to the personal touch that makes these films so honest and true. And honesty and truth is going to be quite a recurring theme in this segment. So when it comes to Judd Apatow's films, I want to do my top 5, but it's kind of hard to separate what counts as a Judd Apatow film because he's worked mostly as a producer in both film and TV, but also as a writer and a director and in some cases even a cameo actor. But for me, I'm going to draw my top 5 out of movies he's either written or directed or both. In that case, to mention the movies that he has produced and that you might think of when you think of comedy in the 21st century are movies like Talladega Nights, Anchorman 1 and 2, Forgetting Sarah Marshall, Step Brothers, Superbad, Get Him to the Greek, Bridesmaids, The 5-Year Engagement, Pop Star Never Stop Stopping, The Big Sick, Begin Again, which is not necessarily a comedy movie, but I still like that movie quite a lot. He's done so much with TV when it comes to Pete Holmes' Crashing, Love with Gillian Anderson, Freaks and Geeks, Undeclared, Girls, The Critic, The Larry Sanders Show, where he got his start working under Gary Shandling. Even an episode of The Simpsons, like I mentioned earlier. But I suppose my honorable mentions for this list, the great movies that didn't make it on, will be movies like You Don't Mess with the Zohan, which I've mentioned earlier in this podcast as being one of my favorite comedies on Netflix. If you haven't watched it yet, please watch it. It's so funny. And it's probably the only exception to Judd Apatow's sort of write what you know rule, because it's about, an Israeli super spy with abs. two types of things and characteristics of a character you wouldn't really see in his other movies. Pineapple Express, which is the all-time greatest stoner action movie. This is 40, Trainwreck, which has LeBron James in it. I mean, this guy has directed LeBron James. He has an upcoming movie about George Carlin. It's a documentary, and I am so excited for this because George Carlin is one of my all-time favorite stand-ups. And his stand-up special, Judd Apatow, The Return. Now, he didn't direct this, and I don't know if stand-up specials count as movies, but still, it's hilarious. Anyway, to get into our top 5, let's start with number 5. I have Knocked Up. Now, Knocked Up is the story of a rising journalist who hits a serious bump in the road after a one-night stand with the slacker Ben Stone, played by Seth Rogen, and that results in pregnancy. Now, rather than raise the baby on her own, this character is played by Katherine Heigl, by the way, she decides to give Ben a chance to prove that he's father material. Unsure if he's ready to be a parent, they both wonder if they would be compatible as life partners. Now, this movie came out to be when Judd was pitching movies to Seth Rogen, but Seth sort of kept pitching these like huge high-concept sci-fi movies, and Judd Apatow just said, all you have to do to make people laugh is like be yourself, or like stand, or get someone pregnant, and then henceforth the idea for Knocked Up was born. It sort of seems to have developed Judd Apatow's appreciation for working with people, making their sort of breakout lead performance, because of the passion and the drive and the energy that they can bring to a performance like this. In this case, Seth Rogen was told to have read with every single actress that came to audition for what eventually became Katherine Heigl's role. Katherine Heigl did admit that while she enjoyed working with Judd Apatow, she had a hard time enjoying Knocked Up because she found the movie a little sexist. But, as Judd Apatow responded in an interview, she said the characters in Knocked Up are sexist at times, but that's because they're immature people who are afraid of women and relationships and need to learn how to grow up. And that's what the movie is about. It comes from authentic experiences as well. There's the final scene, spoiler alert for a movie that came out like 10 years ago. Seth Rogen and Katherine Heigl's character, Katherine Heigl is about to go into labor, and they call their doctor, and he's in San Francisco for a bar mitzvah. So this actually happened to Judd Apatow and Leslie Mann, his wife, and he drew from that experience, and that's sort of what he does with a lot of his movies. It's that authentic touch that I keep referring to that brings the truth. Funny People is number 4. So this movie is about George Simmons, played by Adam Sandler, who becomes Ira's mentor, who's played by Seth Rogen, as he learns that he has a fatal disease. They become close friends, and George teaches Ira how to do stand-up, and Ira helps George sort of define his legacy. When an old flame of George's appears and the disease goes into remission, George gets a chance to reevaluate his life and figure out what's really important to him. So, in a bunch of interviews, Judd Apatow talks about how this movie is about why comedians like making comedy and how they feel about it. It talks about the obsession of making comedy, and the film tries to make sense of whether or not comedians are paying for this obsession, and if they're crazy egomaniac jerks. It also was inspired partly by his experience with his mother's illness, and how she was happier when she didn't think she was going to live, but when her medicine started working, she got caught up in the neuroses of life. Eventually those two ideas sort of combined and became Funny People. This is also Judd Apatow and Adam Sandler's first movie as director and actor. After, Apatow wrote You Don't Mess with the Zohan and Adam Sandler starred in it, but this is the first time they actually got to work together on set, I suppose, after, being roommates at the beginning of their respective careers. Number 3, we have, and I know you're sick and tired of hearing this, but The King of Staten Island. I'll keep the summary quick. It's about Pete Davidson's character Scott, who is in this case of Arrested Development after the passing of his father, and how he must sort of find purpose and do something with his life. What can I say about this movie that I haven't already said? One thing I will say is, in a lot of interviews, Judd Apatow talks about how this is a movie that he wrote along with Pete Davidson and his writing partner, Dave Cyrus, to do with sacrifice. He always wanted to make a movie about sacrifice, and this is sort of what led to what it was. It's this emotionally truthful, traumatic film that is emotionally truthful because, what makes this movie stand out as Apatow's most mature and emotionally resonant film is the fact that Pete Davidson didn't have a line that he didn't want to cross emotionally like most creators would at this point. Take the opening scene. While most comedians would use the opening scene as a way to introduce a character with a joke, this movie does it with a suicide attempt. Establishing that it's not just this different, more mature movie, but it's also not afraid to tackle the depth and nature of trauma in this character and in this story. And it's not afraid to mine Pete Davidson for the authentic experiences that make him what he is. It outlines this slow and difficult road to self-discipline and emotional maturity that comes with finding a purpose. And it's his most mature movie yet. At number 2, we have The 40-Year-Old Virgin. Andy Sitzer is an amiable single guy who works at a big box store played by Steve Carell. He lives alone and spends his free time curating an action figure collection and playing video games and stuff. But despite being 40, Andy has never had sex or even a romantic relationship. When his friends figure it out, they try to get him laid. This comes from this working with Steve Carell on the set of Anchorman, noticing how funny he is, but also Steve Carell's sketch that he's been working on from his Second City improv days about this 40-year-old virgin, where he plays this character who's at a poker game and they're all talking about sex, and it's his turn to talk about a story, and he says something about breasts feeling like a bag of sand, and it's very clear that this is a virgin. However, what makes this movie honest and true and authentic, again, to use those buzzwords as they are, is the fact that this is a film not about a 40-year-old virgin, but about the shame and embarrassment behind not finding romantic connection in your life. When he was trying to come up with the final scene when Steve Carell's character finally has sex, to portray the happiness of it, Judd and Steve Carell were having this tough time working on how to sort of show the happiness that comes from finally having sex. And after, dealing with among themselves and consulting with Gary Shandling, they came up with the idea that he should sing. And originally they planned to do it like a Bollywood number, and I feel like what eventually ended up being the final scene is sort of like a parody of that, which is still absolutely one of the funniest but most authentic portrayals of happiness I've seen in a movie. Like, that's probably very accurate. But for number 1, and this is a movie that I don't think a lot of people know is a Judd Apatow movie. I don't know if it really would be expected to be at the top of anyone's Judd Apatow list, but it is for me. It's his documentary, The Zen Diaries of Gary Shandling. It's this 2-part in-depth look at the life and career and complex internal struggles of Judd Apatow's mentor, Gary Shandling, who is an influential stand-up comedian and actor, and it's based on Gary Shandling's personal diaries. It's this deeply affecting movie about the meaning of life. It talks about how Gary Shandling's comedy was always in pursuit of the truth and dealt with the complexities of real life. This is his message to the world, a message that I feel like he was trying to deliver through his comedy, but Judd Apatow sort of streamlined and provided to the world on a mass scale. It began when he was going through Gary's belongings after his passing and found these journals full of jokes and thoughts. And originally he cut up 5 minutes from a bunch of footage for the funeral, but that sort of became this documentary project afterwards. It dealt with Gary Shandling's spirituality and sense of truth through art, which I suppose is why we see so much emphasis on authenticity and truth in Judd Apatow's work, because Gary Shandling was the person that taught Judd Apatow pretty much a lot based on what I know. Obviously, I don't know much. When you look at his interviews, you see Judd Apatow as like a bookshelf that's larger than my room. He does say that he likes to read self-help books. So maybe that's got something to do with it. But it's this collection of remembrances. It's not like a thoroughly researched biography film. It's tons of comedians that were all influenced and inspired by Gary Shandling, as well as his own personal writings. And these writings come to life and sort of illustrate the way Apatow makes this an engaging 4-hour experience. It's this look. It's this beautifully even look. I guess you could call it an equilibrial look. I don't know if that's a word. I'm just going to use it. At someone who brings meaningful change into other people's life through his comedy, but also struggles to find that sense of fulfillment within himself as he's dealing with the complexities of being alive and performing. Even if the film didn't include footage from Gary Shandling's funeral service, it felt like a beautiful 4-hour eulogy. Sure, Judd Apatow's movies steer longer than most comedies do, or even most movies. But that's what makes it work. Judd Apatow isn't making movies, he's telling stories. And everything he does is in the best interests of the particular story that he's working on. There's heart, there's authenticity, and there's truth. And the comedy that comes from these elements are what makes Judd Apatow my greatest inspiration. So I'm really glad I bought that masterclass subscription and watched his whole masterclass. I suggest you do too. With that, thank you for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and leave us a review. You can follow us on Twitter at GSMC_movies, or you can find us on Facebook at GSMC Movie Podcast. Thank you for listening. This has been Shubh, and to quote one of my idol Judd Apatow's films, stay classy, San Diego.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.